We're joined once again from New York City by Andrew Revkin, author and contributing blogger at the New York Times .Earth blog. This is our second installment in our week-long look at framing the discussion around energy efficiency. Today, we want to talk about what can be done to make our cities more eco-friendly. Hi again, Andrew.
It's good to be with you.
I want to begin by discussing one school of thought in making urban areas more environmentally friendly, and that is this idea is that to rebuild or restore what's already there. And over the last several decades, from Europe to North America and now in Asia, rivers are being restored by a process called daylighting. What is that?
Well, this overarching issue of how to make cities more energy efficient and more functional in this century of climate change has two components. One is, what do you do with existing older cities? This is the Chicagos, the New Yorks, the Torontos, to make them smarter in a sense, able to be more resilient and also to use energy more thriftily. And the other is, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute, is about the big, fast-growing cities of the world in developing countries. So in the older ones, what's been discovered is there are ways to kind of uninvent a city, or at least portions of it, that can make both the climate, the microclimate, the local climate in particular neighborhoods, more comfortable, even in facing things like more of a risk of downpours or just hot summers. And in Seoul, South Korea, a couple of years ago for the New York Times, I went to South Korea to report a story about a remarkable transition of this sort. Lee Myung-bak, who's now the president, was the mayor of Seoul a while back, and he looked at this horrible tangle of highways that had evolved in the middle of that city in the 60s and 70s after the great buildup following the Korean War. And he realized, the heart of our city, the place that was the historical center, was buried and forgotten. There was a stream that had run through that part of Seoul, and now there was just this traffic tangle. And he said, we're going to rip this up and daylight, re-expose this little stream that used to be there. And he's a mayor who, and when he was in the private sector, his nickname was Bulldozer. So he had the political heft to be able to move things forward. And not in an onerous way. He had the ability to convene every part of society that mattered. And he got the job done, and they stripped out all these ancient, not ancient, but sort of classic 20th century elevated highways, and they exposed this stream. And it now is a beautiful kind of a several-mile-long corridor of green through the heart of Seoul. And people migrate to that place in the evening and at lunchtime, and thousands of picnickers and strollers. And it's a highly artificial ecology. In fact, the water is mostly pumped from a nearby river to the head of the stream. But it's lowered the temperature of that corridor several degrees. It's reduced the air pollution. When they did this redesign, they added bus lanes and when they took away those highway lanes, and now the transportation issues have been significantly resolved. So this shows you the potential in even a big city like Seoul, a huge place, to have that kind of change. And this is percolating here and there. Even Yonkers, New York, the city of Yonkers, just north of New York City, is looking at the Sawmill River, which runs through a big giant culvert underneath the town. And when the economy comes back, they're hoping that they can rip that out and restore their stream too.
What about Vancouver? I understand there might be something going on there. Are you familiar with that?
Well, Vancouver was full of salmon creeks for the longest time, and they also became mostly sewer lines or stormwater drains. And there, too, there's an effort to do the same thing, to strip away some of those engineered systems. And some people, city planners, are calling this green infrastructure. In other words, moving from gray infrastructure, costly concrete that doesn't have a resilience to it, and moving more toward literally a more natural way of dealing with stormwater and that kind of thing. Now, that corridor I talked about in Seoul is also functions as a great sort of a sluice for stormwater when that happens. That whole area is designed to be flooded when it needs to get the water out of the center of Midtown. And I think looking forward in the century, you're going to see a mix of, hopefully, you'll see a mix of smart design that incorporates those kinds of green infrastructure, but also, I'll just switch to another highly technological option. Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia has built, and this was all done with private financing. This is a city that's periodically inundated, like Mumbai in India, with mega floods when there's heavy rains in the hills. All that water sort of pours into the city. And they built an underground tunnel, a water tunnel through Kuala Lumpur that most of the time is actually a highway lane, a highway tunnel. It's an underground sort of shortcut and it's a toll road. So it's a profit-making center for the company that built it. But every once in a while, when they have one of these sort of gully washers, they close the tunnel to cars. They have enough advance warning they can do that, and this system works as a super-duper storm drain for those rare but very disruptive flooding events. And again, I think looking forward, you'll see a mix of these things. Chicago, the New York Times recently wrote a big story about how Chicago is working on pervious pavement, and that kind of thing, so you can start to sort of reimagine these older cities in a way that makes them more functional.
Let me ask you this. You've laid out a lot of examples and illustrated cities advancing or moving forward and trying new things. I guess the question is, to what extent is a community's relationship with its waterways a reflection of its stage of development? What does it really say?
Well, I live along the Hudson River north of New York City, and we saw in the 20th century, and I'm sure this is true, well, I know it's true in a number of Canadian cities I visited, our relationship with water in the mid-20th century was mostly as a place to dump something and let it go out to the sea. And that period of the industrialization, that sort of unbridled industrialization, gave way as we became more prosperous as communities to rising concern about these rivers that were despoiled and full of the industrial and septic outflow. And we did a big and pretty remarkable job of cleaning things up. And the Hudson River now, all along the banks, in the mid-90s we did a series of stories at the Times about the revival of this river, where you actually saw communities that had for decades literally turned their backs on the river. So all the functionality and all the activity was in city plazas away from the river. Now it's all been turned back toward the waterfront. And it's just a remarkable thing to see. And it speaks of the potential, there's so much resilience in natural systems if you give them a little space or a little bit of, again, wisdom, so that we design our systems and our landscapes, our human landscapes, in a way that gives nature room to function. You can have an amazing sort of confluence of human and ecological activity in one place, and it's a wonderful thing when you see it.
Okay, I want you to put your water wings away for just a minute, bring out your land legs, because I want to talk to you a little bit about how some governments are reimagining how their cities move. And one of the ideas that some major cities are seeking to improve traffic is through what's known as congestion pricing, which is essentially a system of charging users in periods of peak demand to reduce traffic congestion. How effective, in your opinion, Andrew, has this method been?
It's where it's been established, it can really work. And the City of London was probably the prime example of where the mayor and city government ended up building the case and for having a very high price put on automobile traffic into the central corridors in London. And so that fostered a shift in people's norms. And if you absolutely have to drive in, or if you're wealthy enough to drive in, you do that. And if not, then there are other alternatives. Of course, in London, there's the tube, the underground, and mass transit of other kinds. So it's just a way to shift. It's the polluter pays principle, but applied to traffic lanes, just like we did to pollution in the 20th century. Now, in New York City, the mayor has had a harder time with this. He wanted to go, Mayor Bloomberg has been pushing for the same kind of system. And also on bridges and tunnels coming into the city, there's been a shift toward having what's called congestion pricing there too, so that at peak times of day, you have a higher fee to try to foster some shifts in behavior toward but that's just evening out the transportation flow. That's not changing it fundamentally. So it's a system that can work. The problem for the mayor of New York City is some of these issues have to be resolved through the state government as well in Albany, and there's been a big fight over this because suburban voters who the governor and the state assembly care about have a different view of congestion pricing than the city dwellers. It hasn't really been worked out yet in New York. But there are other cities around the world as well are moving toward that kind of system.
Well, let me ask you that, because it's not just London. I mean, Stockholm, Singapore, Milan, they all have similar ways of doing this. Why aren't, you talked about the politics in New York being a hang-up, but why aren't more urban cities getting on board with this idea? Is it simply a matter of politics that's holding them back?
Well, I think there are some issues with equity and anything that sort of punishes people or offers an incentive that can be afforded by some and not by others can have some issues. You know, there could be a fight over that kind of thing. That's one problem. And the other reality is a lot of human beings are still deeply in love with this thing called the automobile. It's kind of a functional, it's almost a part of the body. There was a recent survey in the United States of general attitudes, and there are a lot of people who crave their time in the automobile, who actually enjoy the commute because it's their one private moment to listen to the radio station they want without someone in the household saying, shut that off. Now, of course, because we're all dangerously multitasking, it gives them that cushion of being in your little bubble for a while and having control over your life. That's what a lot of people's resistance to mass transit is about, the idea of maintaining some control. And I think, again, in our modern 21st century existence, there's a tendency toward craving some of those things. So some of this goes to some pretty deep-rooted human behavioral issues. We like independence, too.
Well, I'm not sure if people who commute a very long time to come into Toronto, we have some of the longest commute times in the world, enjoy their time in their car. But we as a city are really struggling with what to do. And I'm wondering, do you see any solution? I don't know how well you know Toronto, but where we could apply those sort of traffic reduction plans to a city like Toronto, which is growing, it's big, there are many suburban communities, and commuting times are a few hours for some people.
It's a challenge, I think, in the States and probably in Toronto. There's what I see in the times I've been to Toronto, and I wrote about this on .earth at one point. One thing that struck me there, again, it's very much a four-season city where you could be overheated at some time of year and pummeled with incredibly cold, horrific winter weather and others. Toronto has established this underground corridors. I think it's about 23 kilometers of...
Yeah, the path system.
Right, of underground tunnels and walkways, and it's become quite a felicitous, quite a beautiful part of the city complex. And it gives you more of a sense of being able to, as I did recently when I came up to the Perimeter Institute for a meeting on energy, I flew to that little airport right in downtown, got off took the little ferry across into town, and one of the times I was there a couple of years ago, I just was able to walk literally, basically you kind of enter the city in an environmentally secure way through a tunnel and onward into wherever you wanted to go potentially without actually having to worry about weather and that kind of thing. And that, again, I love the outdoors too, and when it's appropriate, I'll walk outdoors, but having that ability to come in and have the knowledge you'll get to where you need to go, when you need to be there, and you can have some independence about how to get there and not necessarily rely on a car is a great thing.
Okay, Andrew, we have just about a minute left, but I do want to ask you one thing, and this is this idea that we've been talking about reimagining and rebuilding cities with what is already there, but there are people who say, that's not the way to go. Let's start from scratch with new technologies. Let's just start this all anew. So what do you think is the best mix to improve our energy efficiency in cities? Is it reimagining and rebuilding, or, a combination of those two?
Well, we're definitely in an all-of-the-above situation. Remember, we're poised for the biggest build-out of human structures in the history of the planet. In fact, there's, by some calculations, in the next 30 years or so, humanity, mainly because of the growth in Asia and China, India, is going to build more new structures than all the structures that have been built through all history, if you go by square footage. So that says, get ahead of that. That's where you have the biggest gains by far. Again, repurposing, making older structures in cities more efficient is very important. But if you can get ahead and leapfrog in the way you build buildings, so the energy going into the building of it is greatly reduced, and then make it a smarter structure. Right now, you have this situation in parts of India where shopping malls are being built that are air conditioned but not insulated. Now that doesn't strike me as a 21st century, way to go. So anything that can be done to facilitate a shift toward using energy more smartly as we build out this great sort of peak of human construction in the next few decades is certainly a wise thing.
Okay, Andrew, we'll have to leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.